Chapter 3. The Human Race Transforming, Real Explanation of the Human Condition. Chapter 3 begins with William Blake's stunning etching, Albion Arose. It shows a naked man standing, arms outstretched in an exalted, free state, with wonderful bursting light radiating out from him in all directions. Chapter 3.1 Summary. What will now be presented is the human race liberating and transforming, psychosis addressing and solving, fully accountable, real biological explanation of the human condition that was introduced in Chapter 1. This is the understanding that the human race has been working tirelessly towards since humans first became fully conscious beings, some 2 million years ago, and our deeply psychologically troubled, conflicted state of the human condition emerged. And given the just described extreme threat of terminal alienation and extinction of the human race from mechanistic science's entrenched denial of the psychological nature of the human condition, this is the psychologically redeeming understanding of the human condition that is now desperately needed to bring about a new world for humans that is free of the human condition. A world in which we all stand liberated from Plato's terribly lonely, dark, bat-filled cave of alienation and magnificently transformed. The freedom Blake so wonderfully anticipated in his above picture. Chapter 3.2. We cannot endure being faced by the problem of the human condition forever. Before presenting this dreamed-of, human race transforming explanation of the human condition, the following extraordinarily honest words from Nikolai Berdyaev's 1931 book, The Destiny of Man, provide a powerful summary of all that was just said in Chapter 2 about the stalled, festering state of science, and thus of the human race. Firstly, in regard to our species' overall plight, Berdyaev wrote that, and part of this extract was referred to in paragraph 181, the memory of a lost paradise, of a golden age, our species' pre-human condition afflicted state of original cooperative loving innocence, is very deep in man, together with a sense of guilt and sin, and a dream of regaining the kingdom of heaven. We are faced with a profound enigma. How could man have renounced paradise, which he recalls so longingly in our world aeon? How could he have fallen away from it? When it came to our consciousness-induced psychosis, he recognized that philosophers and scientists have done very little to elucidate the problem of man. Psychologists were wrong in assuming that man was a healthy creature, mainly conscious and intellectual, and should be studied from that point of view. Man is a sick being. The human soul is divided. An agonizing conflict between opposing elements is going on in it. The distinction between the conscious and the subconscious mind is fundamental for the new psychology. Significantly, Berdyaev also acknowledged how our species' immense fear of the human condition has blocked access to finding understanding of it, writing that knowledge requires great daring. It means victory over ancient, primeval terror. Fear makes the search for truth and the knowledge of it impossible. Knowledge implies fearlessness. Particularly bitter is moral knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. But the bitterness is due to the fallen state of the world. Moral knowledge is the most bitter and the most fearless of all, for in it sin and evil are revealed to us along with the meaning and value of life. There is a deadly pain in the very distinction of good and evil, of the valuable and the worthless. We cannot rest in the thought that that distinction is ultimate. We cannot bear to be faced forever with the distinction between good and evil. Ethics must be both theoretical and practical. That is, it must call for the moral reformation of life. This implies that ethics is bound to contain a prophetic element. It must be a revelation of a clear conscience, unclouded by social conventions. Note Berdyaev's accord with Janov's fundamental point that fear paralyzes thought in paragraph 221. No, we cannot bear to be faced forever with the deadly distinction of good and evil, of the valuable and the worthless, nor with the resulting social conventions of having to live with the psychologically sick state of alienated denial as our only means of coping with that patently untrue distinction between the valuable and the worthless. Permanent damnation and terminal alienation are simply not acceptable options for the human race. But to find the liberating, exonerating, reconciling and rehabilitating understanding of our divided condition, and by so doing bring about the new psychology, and with it the transforming moral reformation of life, required victory over the ancient primeval terror of our condition. A victory that could only be achieved by a revelation of a clear conscience, unclouded by social conventions of denial, because only those who don't suffer from the terror of the human condition could hope to fearlessly investigate the subject. Yes, to find understanding of the human condition necessarily required a truthful, clear conscience, guided, instinctual approach, not a resigned to living in denial of the human condition, alienated from the truth, blocking out of condemning moral instincts, hiding in Plato's cave, intellectual approach. It is simply not possible to build the truth from a position of denial or lying. You can't think effectively, insightfully, prophetically, if you're not being honest. Indeed, as I pointed out in chapter 2.12, trying to investigate reality while living in denial of any truths that brought the, for most people, deadly, painful issue of the human condition into focus, as mechanistic science has done, was an extremely compromised and deficient way of searching for knowledge. In fact, it is a measure of the blindness of human condition avoiding denial-based thinking and the effectiveness of human condition confronting honest thinking that when the whole truth about our condition is finally reached, as it now has been, it can appear so straightforward and simple that it seems self-evident. But simplicity has always been a hallmark of insightful thought, as the pioneering biologist Alan Savory observed in 1988. Whenever there has been a major insoluble problem for mankind, the answer, when finally found, has always been very simple. For instance, when Charles Darwin put forward his breakthrough and necessarily exceptionally fearless and truthful thinking-based insight of natural selection, it was, in hindsight, such a simple explanation that the eminent biologist of the time, the aforementioned Thomas Huxley, was prompted to exclaim, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." So yes, the author, George Seaver, was prescient when, in anticipating just how simple the explanation of the riddle of life's meaning and mystery, namely the human condition, would be, he wrote in 1947 that the ultimate thought, the thought which holds the clue to the riddle of life's meaning and mystery, must be the simplest thought conceivable, the most natural, the most elemental, and therefore also the most profound. But while the crux question facing the human race of the much-needed clarification of the nature of good and evil does have an amazingly simple answer, the implications of it could not be more significant, far-reaching, or exciting. Chapter 3.3 The Psychosis Addressing and Solving real explanation of the human condition. In another brilliant cartoon, below paragraph 242, Michael Leunig succinctly dares to ask the fundamental question of what does the chaotic, traumatic and strife-torn life of humans all mean? How are we to make sense of our existence? He has done so by placing a very perplexed and distressed gentleman behind a big telescope, which Leunig has labelled an understandoscope, through which he peers into a sea of apparent madness. Everywhere he looks, there is tumultuous congestion. There are people furiously arguing and fighting with each other. There is a church where people pray for forgiveness and salvation. And there are vehicles polluting the chaos with fumes and noise. And in this 1984 drawing, Leunig even seems to have predicted a climactic demonstration of all our human excesses and frustrations when, on September the 11th, 2001, terrorists flew planes into the tall, square-shaped towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, when he drew a plane heading towards big city buildings. Well, it is precisely this great burning, searing question of what is wrong with us humans? How are we to understand it all? How are we to make sense of human existence? That is now going to be answered here. The explanation to be given here, in full, is the understandoscope we have always wanted, needed and sought. As emphasised in Chapter 2, to provide this all-exciting, human race liberating, amazingly simple, fully accountable, true explanation of the human condition requires starting from the unequivocally honest basis of acknowledging that humans did once live in a completely loving, unconditionally selfless, altruistic state, and that it was only after the emergence of our conscious mind that our present, good and evil afflicted, immensely psychologically upset condition emerged. If we do this and consider what would happen when a conscious mind emerged in the presence of an already established, cooperative, loving, instinctive state, given what human condition avoiding mechanistic science has managed to discover about the gene-based natural selection process and how nerves are capable of memory, then the explanation is right there in front of us. Clearly, since our altruistic moral instincts are only genetic orientations to the world and not understandings of it, when our fully conscious, reasoning, self-managing mind emerged, it would, in order to find the understandings it needed to effectively manage events, have had to challenge those innate, born with genetic, instinctive orientations, which would have led to a psychologically upsetting clash with our moral instincts. The exceptionally clear conscience-guided, truthful and thus effective thinking, prophetic naturalist Eugene Marais was on the right track when, as mentioned in paragraph 187, he recognised that as the individual memory slowly emerges in humans, the instinctive soul becomes just as slowly submerged. For a time, it is almost as though there were a struggle between the two. Berdyaev was also approaching the truth when, as just mentioned, he wrote that the human soul is divided. An agonizing conflict between opposing elements is going on in it. The distinction between the conscious and the subconscious mind is fundamental for the new psychology. Other thinkers such as Arthur Koestler, Eric Newman, Paul MacLean, Julian Jaynes and Christopher Booker have also delved into the problem of the human condition to a similar depth to Marais and Berdyaev. But what was missing was the clarifying explanation of the nature of that struggle and conflict between our instincts and our consciousness. After all, as pointed out in chapter 2.6, even Moses' Genesis story of the Garden of Eden contains the truth that our corrupted, fallen condition occurred when our conscious mind and disobedient free will emerged from an original, presumably instinctive, idyllic state, and Plato recognized there was a conflict between noble, good instincts, a white horse, against an ignoble, bad, crooked, unlawful deeds producing conscious intellect, a dark horse. But the degree of insight apparent in these descriptions didn't liberate humanity from the human condition. So, yes, what is the particular distinction between our instincts and intellect that cause the psychologically upset state of our good and evil afflicted condition? As just stated, the answer is that the gene-based refinement or learning system is only capable of orientating species, whereas the nerve-based refinement or learning system has the potential to understand the nature of change. To present the explanation in more detail. Firstly, to explain what instincts are. While animals largely depend on their nervous system to coordinate their movement and control how they react to their environment, other systems such as their hormonal, circulatory, digestive, immune and reproductive systems also influence how they behave. Obviously, all these systems that affect how a species of animal moves and behaves have been acted on by natural selection in the course of adapting that species over many generations to its environment. It is these naturally selected genetic traits that orient an animal's movements and behaviour that are referred to as its instincts. Animals move about and behave in many different ways. They fight and court each other, they build nests, they search for food, they migrate, etc. And natural selection has given them genetic programming, instincts, to control and orient all this movement and behaviour. Plants could be said to have instincts for the control and orientation of their behaviour. But because they don't move about and have such constantly changing behaviour as animals, instincts for the control of movement and behaviour are more associated with animals than plants. In the case of consciousness, and this was briefly explained in paragraph 61, there is one aspect of nerves' ability to control how animals react to their environment that has the potential to give rise to consciousness. And this is an aspect that is largely independent of any instinctive orientations of an animal's nervous system that have developed through natural selection. This aspect of the nervous system that gave rise to the potential to develop a conscious understanding of cause and effect is nerves' ability to store impressions, what we refer to as memory. An electric current passed through a nerve leaves an imprint of its passage in the nerve after the current has passed. This imprint represents a memory of that piece of information that passed through the nerve. This ability to remember past events makes it possible to compare them with current events and identify regularly occurring experiences. This knowledge of, or insight into, what has commonly occurred in the past makes it possible to predict what is likely to happen in the future and to adjust your behaviour accordingly. Once insights into the nature of change are put into effect, the self-modified behaviour starts to provide feedback, refining the insights further. Predictions are compared with outcomes, and so on. Much developed, and such refinement occurred in the human brain. Nerves can sufficiently associate information to reason how experiences are related, learn to understand, and become conscious of, or aware of, or intelligent about the relationship between events that occur through time. Thus, consciousness means being sufficiently aware of how experiences are related to attempt to manage change from a basis of understanding. I should mention that admitting the above obvious explanations of what instincts actually are and what consciousness actually is has been avoided by human condition avoiding mechanistic science. This is because while we couldn't truthfully explain our corrupted human condition, Any admission that we have cooperative and loving moral instincts and a conscious mind that corrupted that pure, innocent state was unbearable. And so to avoid any thought journey getting underway that might lead to those condemning realizations, the keepers of the lie, mechanistic scientists, realized it was best to stop that thought journey at the outset by claiming we just don't know what instincts actually are and consciousness actually is. When I tried to explain my instinct versus intellect explanation of the human condition to the former chief scientific advisor to the UK government, Lord Robert May, at Oxford University in 2014, he said, "But Jeremy, we don't know what instincts actually are or how we actually got them." Certainly instincts are a bit complicated, but as the explanation and description of instincts that I have just given evidences, not nearly as bewildering as May tried to make out. In the case of consciousness, Chapter 7.2 described in some detail why and how consciousness has been deliberately left cloaked in mystery and confusion. Chapter 7 also explains much more about the nature of consciousness and also how we humans manage to become conscious when other animals haven't. So while the gene-based learning system does involve the genetic selection of nerve pathways and networks, what is meant by the nerve-based learning system is that dimension or aspect of the nervous system that is to do with understanding cause and effect. This honest but not very explanatory definition of instincts from the Merriam-Webster dictionary makes this particular difference clear. Instincts are a largely inheritable and unalterable tendency of an organism to make a complex and specific response to environmental stimuli without involving reason. The significance of the nerve-based learning system becoming sufficiently developed in humans for us to become conscious and able to effectively manage events was that our conscious intellect was then in a position to wrest control from our gene-based learning system's instincts, which, up until then, had been in charge of our lives. Basically, once our self-adjusting intellect, or ability to reason, emerged, it was capable of taking over the management of our lives from the instinctive orientations we had acquired through the natural selection of genetic traits that adapted us to our environment. Moreover, at the point of becoming conscious, the nerve-based learning system should wrest management of the individual from the instincts, because such a self-managing or self-adjusting system is infinitely more efficient at adapting to change than the gene-based learning system, which can only adapt to change very slowly over many generations. However, it was at this juncture, when our conscious intellect challenged our instincts for control, that a terrible battle broke out between our instincts and intellect, the effect of which was the extremely competitive, selfish, and aggressive state that we call the human condition. An analogy will help further explain the origin of our human condition. I should mention that a condensation of the explanation of the human condition given in this chapter, in particular some of the Adam Stork analogy, was included in Chapter 1's summary of the contents of this book, so the reader should expect some repetition of that material. Chapter 3.4 The Story of Adam Stork. What distinguishes humans from other animals is our fully conscious mind, our ability to understand and thus manage the relationship between cause and effect. However, prior to becoming fully conscious and able to self-manage, consciously decide how to behave, our earliest ape ancestors were controlled by and obedient to their instincts, as other animals continue to be. Of course, humans are still apes, so when I say ape ancestor, I mean when we were like existing non-human great apes. Aldous Huxley, author of famous novels such as Brave New World, acknowledged how other animals live, and also how our distant ancestors would have lived, obedient to their instincts, when he wrote in 1946, "Non-rational creatures do not look before or after, but live in the animal eternity of a perpetual present. Instinct is their animal grace and constant inspiration, and they are never tempted to live otherwise than in accord with their own immanent law." Thanks to his reasoning powers and to the instrument of reason, language, man, in his merely human condition, lives nostalgically, apprehensively, and hopefully in the past and future as well as in the present. I've underlined part of this passage because it raises the important question of what would happen if a species was tempted to live otherwise than in accord with their own instincts, to in effect break that immanent law. As Huxley infers, humans must have done when we became fully conscious. The following analogy involving migrating storks provides an illustration of what would happen. At this point in the book, paragraph 251, a drawing of this analogy is included that we encourage you to view. Many bird species are perfectly oriented to instinctive migratory flight paths. Each winter, without ever learning where to go and without knowing why, they quit their established breeding grounds and migrate to warmer feeding grounds. They then return each summer, and so the cycle continues. Over the course of thousands of generations and migratory movements, only those birds that happen to have a genetic makeup that inclined them to follow the right route survived. Thus, through natural selection, they acquired their instinctive orientation. Consider a flock of migrating storks returning to their summer breeding nests on the rooftops of Europe from their winter feeding grounds in southern Africa. Suppose, in the instinct-controlled brain of one of them, we place a fully conscious mind. We call the stork Adam, because we will soon see that, up to a point, this analogy parallels Moses' pre-scientific account of the origin or genesis of the human condition in the Bible, where Adam and Eve take the fruit from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. So, as Adam's stork flies north, he spots an island off to the left with a tree laden with apples. Using his newly acquired conscious mind, Adam thinks, "I should fly down and eat some apples." It seems a reasonable thought, but he can't know if it is a good decision or not until he acts on it. For Adam's new thinking mind to make sense of the world, he has to learn by trial and error, and so he decides to carry out his first grand experiment in self-management by flying down to the island and sampling the apples. But it's not that simple. As soon as Adam's conscious thinking self deviates from his established migratory path, his innocent instinctive self tries to pull him back on course. Again, we encourage you to view a drawing illustrating this analogy above paragraph 251 in the book. In following the flight path past the island, the instinct-obedient self or stork is, in effect, criticising Adam's decision to veer off course. It is condemning his search for understanding. All of a sudden, Adam is in a dilemma. If he obeys his instinctive self and flies back on course, he will remain perfectly oriented, but he'll never learn if his deviation was the right decision or not. All the messages he's receiving from within inform him that obeying his instincts is good, is right. But there's also a new inclination to disobey, a defiance of instinct. Diverting from his course will result in apples and understanding, yet he already sees that doing so will make him feel bad. Uncomfortable with the criticism his newly conscious mind or intellect is receiving from his instinctive self, Adam's first response is to ignore the temptation the apples present and fly back on course. This correction not only makes his instinctive self happy, it also wins back the approval of his fellow storks. For, not having conscious minds, they, like his instinctive self, are innocent, unaware or ignorant of the conscious mind's need to search for knowledge. Furthermore, since Adam's instinctive self developed alongside the natural world, it too reminds him of his instinctive orientation, thus contributing to the criticism of Adam for his rebellious decision. Flying on, however, Adam realizes he can't deny his intellect. Sooner or later, he must find the courage to master his conscious mind by carrying out experiments in understanding. This time he thinks, why not fly down to an island and rest? Again, not knowing any reason why he shouldn't, he proceeds with his experiment. And again, his decision is met with the same chorus of criticism from his instinctive self, from the other storks that were ignorant of the need to search for knowledge, and from the natural world. But this time Adam defies the criticism and perseveres with his experimentation in self-management. His decision, however, means he must now live with the criticism, and immediately he is condemned to a state of upset. A battle has broken out between his instinctive self, which is perfectly oriented to the flight path, and his emerging conscious mind, which needs to understand why that flight path is the correct course to follow. His instinctive self is perfectly oriented, but Adam doesn't understand that orientation. In short, when the fully conscious mind emerged, it wasn't enough for it to be oriented by instincts. It had to find understanding to operate effectively and fulfill its great potential to manage life. Tragically, the instinctive self didn't appreciate that need and tried to stop the mind's necessary search for knowledge, as represented by the latter's experiments in self-management, hence the ensuing battle between instinct and intellect. To refute the criticism from his instinctive self, Adam needed the understanding found by science of the difference in the way genes and nerves process information. He needed to be able to explain that the gene-based learning system can orient species to situations, but is incapable of insight into the nature of change. Genetic selection of one reproducing individual over another reproducing individual, the selection in effect of one idea over another idea, or one piece of information over another piece of information, gives species adaptations or orientations, instinctive programming, for managing life, but those genetic orientations, those instincts, are not understandings. This means that when the nerve-based learning system gave rise to consciousness and the ability to understand the world, it wasn't sufficient to be oriented to the world. Understanding of the world had to be found. The problem, of course, was that Adam had only just taken his first tentative steps in the search for knowledge, and so had no ability to explain anything. It was a catch-22 situation for the fledgling thinker, because to explain himself he needed the very knowledge he was setting out to accumulate. He had to search for understanding, ultimately self-understanding, understanding of why he had to fly off course, without the ability to first explain why he needed to fly off course. And without that defence, he had to live with the criticism from his instinctive self, and was insecure in its presence. I should clarify that while instincts are hardwired genetic programming, and as such cannot literally criticise our conscious mind, they can in effect do so. Our instincts let our conscious mind know when our body needs food, or, as our instinctive conscience clearly does, want us to behave in a cooperative, loving way. And certainly our conscious mind can defy those instinctive orientations if it chooses to. Our conscious mind can feel criticised by our instinctive conscience. It happens all the time. And so to resist the tirade of unjust criticism he was having to endure and mitigate that insecurity, Adam had to do something. But what could he do? If he abandoned the search and flew back on course, he'd gain some momentary relief, but the search would nevertheless remain to be undertaken. So all Adam could do was retaliate against and attack the instinct's unjust criticism, attempt to prove the instinct's unjust criticism wrong, and try to deny or block from his mind the instinct's unjust criticism. And he did all those things. He became angry towards the criticism. In every way he could, he tried to demonstrate his self-worth, prove that he is good and not bad. He shook his fist at the heavens in a gesture of defiance of the implication that he is bad. And he tried to block out the criticism. This block out or denial, including having to invent contrived excuses for his instinct-defying behaviour. In short, his angry, egocentric and alienated state appeared. Adam's intellect or ego, which is just another word for the intellect, since the concise Oxford Dictionary defines ego as the conscious thinking self, became centred or focused on the need to justify itself, selfishly preoccupied, aggressively competing for opportunities to prove he is good and not bad, to validate his worth, to get a win, to essentially eke out any positive reinforcement that would bring him some relief from criticism and sense of worth. He unavoidably became angry, alienated, and egocentrically selfish, aggressive, and competitive. Overall, it was a terrible predicament in which Adam became psychologically upset, a sufferer of psychosis and neurosis. Yes, since according to dictionary.com, osis means abnormal state or condition, and the Penguin Dictionary of Psychology's entry for psych reads, "The oldest and most general use of this term is by the early Greeks, who envisioned the psyche as the soul or the very essence of life." Adam developed a psychosis, or soul illness, and a neurosis, or neuron or nerve or intellect illness. His original gene-based instinctive essence of life soul or psyche became repressed by his intellect for its unjust condemnation of his intellect, and for its part his nerve or neuron-based intellect became preoccupied denying any implication that it is bad. Adam became psychotic and neurotic. But again, without the knowledge he was seeking, without self-understanding, specifically the understanding of the difference between the gene and nerve-based learning systems that science has given us, Adam Stork had no choice but to resign himself to living a psychologically upset life of anger, egocentricity and alienation as the only three responses available to him to cope with the horror of his situation. And by alienation, it should be clear by now that I don't mean alienation from society or some other group or individual, but the situation of being estranged or detached from our own instinctive self and any truthful thinking it inclines our conscious mind to pursue. It was an extremely unfair and difficult, indeed tragic, position for Adam to find himself in. For we can see that while he was good, he appeared to be bad, and had to endure the horror of his psychologically distressed, upset condition until he found the real, as opposed to the invented or contrived, not psychosis recognizing, defense or reason for his mistakes. Basically, suffering upset was the price of his heroic search for understanding. Indeed, it is the tragic yet inevitable situation any animal would have to endure if it transitioned from an instinct control state to an intellect control state. Its instincts would resist the intellect's search for knowledge. Adam's uncooperative and divisive competitive aggression and his selfish, egocentric, self-preoccupied efforts to prove his worth, and his need to deny and evade criticism, essentially embrace a dishonest state, all became an unavoidable part of his personality. Such was Adam Stork's predicament, and such has been the human condition, for it was within our species that the fully conscious mind emerged. What now needs to be explained is how the situation faced by humans when we began searching for knowledge was so much worse than it was for our hypothetical Adam Stork. This is because, as was emphasised in chapters 2.5 to 2.7, our instinctive orientation wasn't to a flight path, but to behaving in an unconditionally selfless, all-loving, cooperative, moral way. So when we started carrying out experiments in understanding, and then unavoidably began reacting defensively in an angry, aggressive, competitive, selfish, and evasive, dishonest way to combat the criticism from our instincts, that divisive response drew even more criticism from our particular cooperative, loving, ideal, behaviour-demanding, integrative, very essence of life, oriented, moral, instinctive self or soul or psyche. A vicious cycle that fueled our upset immensely. Chapter 5 will present the biological explanation of how humans acquired such unconditionally selfless, universally loving moral instincts, the voice of which is our conscience.